So I'm going to start this part of the lecture where I left off. So I left off talking about field labor. Now I want to take a look at how enslaved black women resisted the brutality of slavery. So I would define a resistance in a couple of ways. Um, One, there's everyday forms of resistance that are undercover and wouldn't at first glance be considered resisting. So, like in other words, stealing from the kitchen, but also reclaiming uh, one's humanity through the maintenance of relationships and culture. And the second kind of resistance is the more active and direct resistance. Individuals running away, uh, collective rebellions, directly talking back, that sort of thing. So, in their everyday lives, enslaved women found ways to resist. Uh, their place in the plantation household allowed them, for instance, to poison slaveholders. They also stole food from the kitchen to pass along to children and others on the plantation. And although Southern law did not recognize the rape of a black woman as a crime, when white men tried to rape them, they sometimes fought back. They might also fake illness to gain a reprieve or break from work. Just to give you one example, an enslaved woman named Maria, one of President James K. Polk's slaves. He was president from 1845 to 1849. So Maria repeatedly said she was too sick to work until she was reassigned from the field to the household to weave when she suddenly returned to good health. So some women also resisted having children by having abortions or simply refusing to have sex with the men that the slaveholders chose for them. Though this, of course, could be quite dangerous, women who refused to have children could be sold away from their families or whipped for their refusal. Women also resisted simply by building and trying to protect their families and by forming community among other enslaved women in an attempt to counter slave owners' attempts to dehumanize them. For instance, there was a separate world of enslaved women that fostered female cooperation and interdependence. Older enslaved women, for instance, often helped to care for the children before the children were forced into the fields. So when the children are too young to work in the fields. And in part because men were more likely to be sold off, women who weren't related to each other formed family-like bonds to support and care for each other. So older women also served as doctors and midwives in the absence of adequate medical care. It was older women that often took responsibility for caring for the sick. In short, the formation of community among women was one key way that women resisted the dehumanizing effects of slavery. So the formation of community as well as families. So even though their families were often torn apart when they were sold off on the auction blocks, enslaved men and women did form lasting bonds with one another and get married. Their marriages might not have been legally recognized because enslaved people were not actually allowed to marry legally. They, of course, still had emotional significance. These marriages were often encouraged by slave owners as a way to get enslaved women to have more children, which added to the slave owners' wealth. And marriages of enslaved women were distinct from other marriages for a number of reasons. Women could not depend on men to protect them from whippings and sexual violence. So women, right, could not depend on their husbands to protect them from whippings and sexual violence. And this idea that we have about how marriage was defined was that one role that the husband had was to protect his wife against the outside world, including violence. So enslaved wives and husbands also had no property to share. So the concept of course, femme covert wouldn't have applied anyway because the marriages were not legal. But one way that marriage, non-slave marriages, right, one way that power played out in non-slave marriages was through the ownership of property by the husband or father. So food, clothing, and shelter could also not be provided by the husbands. And in almost all societies where men consistently dominate women, their control is based on male ownership and distribution of property. So the absence of this probably contributed to the independence of enslaved women from men within marriages. between enslaved people. Thus, enslaved families were unusually egalitarian or equal. There simply were not the legal mechanisms in place for husbands to have the same kind of control over their wives as there were for non-slave marriages. So let's now transition to looking at more active and direct forms of resistance. The most common form of resistance was simply running away. Enslaved men and women tried to make it to freedom in the northern states in the 19th century. They tried to make it to Canada, where slavery didn't exist, had been abolished. So men ran away in much larger numbers than women ever did, however. For example, 77% of the runaways advertised in South Carolina during the 1730s were men. So one main way that we know that men ran away in much larger numbers was because slave owners put advertisements in newspapers saying that they would give financial rewards to people who helped in the capture and return of enslaved people who had run away. So the question is, though, why was it that women did not run away as frequently as men? And of course, some of the reasons had to do with childbearing. Most runaways were between 16 and 35 years old, at their physical prime, and a woman of this age was either pregnant, nursing an infant, or had at least one small child to care for. Secondly, another important reason is that women tended to be more concerned with the welfare of their children, which limited their mobility. So they didn't want to leave their child behind. So you can imagine that the third reason is that, if they chose to take their children, that would be very difficult. Taking young children with you while running away meant risking getting caught when children cried. Children slowed runaways down because they needed to be carried, and so on. That said, even though the vast majority of individual runaways were men, there were some runaways who were women, despite the difficulty and all of the dangers that existed for them. For example, one enslaved woman named Maria in Maryland escaped slavery in 1859, just the year before the start of the Civil War, with all 7 of her children with the help of the Underground Railroad. So I skipped this slide. This is actually a slide for a TV series about the Underground Railroad that you can watch. I watched season 1. I haven't watched season 2, but it's really good, and I would recommend it. So the Underground Railroad was not literally underground. It largely consisted of houses where runaway slaves could stop for shelter and safety on their way to freedom. The network was organized primarily by free black people, former slaves, as well as sympathetic whites who were involved also in the abolitionist movement, who had connections to the abolitionist movement. And of course, Harriet Tubman is perhaps the most well-known leader of the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland in 1820. She was born into slavery in Maryland in 1820. She escaped to Philadelphia in 1849, and over the next several years, she made numerous dangerous trips back to Maryland to rescue relatives and other slaves. So just an aside, she was in Maryland, and Maryland was in closer proximity in the 19th century to the free states of the North, where slavery had been gradually abolished in the years following the American Revolution of the 1770s and early 1780s. So it was still incredibly difficult, but it was, relatively speaking, easier for enslaved people to run away from plantations in Maryland because Maryland was closer to the free states of the North. Ultimately, Tubman had a hand in rescuing, we don't know exact numbers, but perhaps around 75 men, women, and children from slavery. She later even became a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War, and there's a drunk history episode about this, which I'll link to as well, which I would usually play in a class, but I'll just link to it online on Canvas. And the Underground Railroad ultimately helped more than 20,000 runaways make their way to freedom. So 20,000 is a pretty significant number, but when you consider that in 1865, 4 million enslaved people were finally emancipated. So it sort of feels like a drop in the bucket, but it's significant nonetheless, not least because it indicates that enslaved people, what they desired was freedom, that they had not adapted or to the institution of slavery, right? So that by running away, they were showing that they were against slavery. Okay, let's see. So there are, of course, slave revolts, which were infrequent but important nonetheless, because they very clearly demonstrated their desire, again, for freedom by enslaved women and men, even if it meant violent revolt against very big odds. So this history often emphasizes, of course, the leadership of men, people like Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. Nat Turner perhaps led the most famous slave revolt in the U.S. In U.S. history in 1831. And though women weren't the main leaders of these rebellions, perhaps more research is needed to find exactly what their leadership role might have been. Women did assist in various ways, assisted these revolts in various ways by serving as lookouts and passing on information from within the plantation household to people planning these revolts. So in addition to slave revolts, there's also, of course, the larger abolitionist movement, this movement against slavery that sought to put an end to the institution of slavery or abolish it. It was a movement led by primarily anti-slavery whites and free African Americans who mainly resided or lived in the North. Many of the free black people were free actually because they had run away themselves or were the descendants of runaways. Again, the leadership of the abolitionist movement is often told through the lens of talking about people like Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery, also runs away. He's perhaps the most famous African American abolitionist of the 19th century. And he's important actually in women's history because he advocated for women's rights at the same time that he advocated for abolition, which was very unusual. But, Frederick Douglass was not the only leader of the movement. White as well as black women played an important role in the movement as well. So the main white leaders of the women's rights movement in the mid to late 19th century, a topic we'll return to later, got their start in the abolitionist movement. So people like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone. Also the first woman from Massachusetts to earn a college degree, that's Lucy Stone. There are also the two sisters. So in this slide, you can see Susan B. Anthony on the left and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right. They get their start in the movement against slavery. You also have, here's an image of Lucy Stone, who was quite radical in her own right. You have the two Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who actually grew up in a slave-owning family, but fled the South for the North and became part of the abolitionist movement. They drew on their religious principles to oppose the institution of slavery, and in doing so, they opposed their family, which owned enslaved people. So female leaders in the movement had to actively not only challenge racism, challenge the institution of slavery, but they had to constantly combat sexism within the abolitionist movement. Often men refused to allow women to speak at meetings and rallies. Men often refused to acknowledge women as intellectual leaders and political leaders, but nevertheless, women in the movement persisted. And I think it's important to also highlight, before concluding, the role played by Sojourner Truth, somebody I'm going to return to a little later in the class when we talk about women's rights of the 19th century. So Sojourner Truth is interesting because she is perhaps the most well-known African-American leader of the abolitionist movement, the most famous African-American activist within the women's rights movement in many ways. She's certainly not the only African-American activist or leader in the women's rights movement, but she has become one of the most well-known. She was born into slavery in upstate New York, and in the years following the Revolution, the American Revolution, she was freed because of the gradual abolition law that was put into place in New York that very gradually freed people over many years. So actually, when Sojourner Truth was freed, a few of her children were still enslaved. So she was free, but her children were still enslaved because of how gradual this abolitionist law was, or abolition law was. There's also people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a prolific poet, a writer, an abolitionist, and an activist for women's rights. So if you want to learn more about Sojourner Truth, I would recommend A Life, a Symbol by Nell Irvin Painter. It's quite good, and Nell Irvin Painter is one of the preeminent historians of both African American and women's history. And if you want to learn more in general about the abolitionist movement, this book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition by Manisha Sinha, that came out just like 2 years ago, something like that. It's a very recently published book. So I'd recommend both of these books highly. Okay, so above all, the abolitionist movement was the first mass interracial movement in the United States. It made slavery the subject of national debate and ultimately helped to lead to a very intense sectional divide between the North and the South, leading to the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which ultimately abolished slavery and freed 4 million African Americans from bondage. It had one exception, something we'll return to later. It said that people could still be enslaved as convicts. So if somebody was sent to prison, they could still be forced to work without pay. And so this is really the beginnings of the association between African Americans and criminality, because after the Civil War, you see in the South especially this effort to put as many African Americans in prison as possible, and often very, very, very petty charges, like petty theft, and sometimes they were trumped up charges as well. So this is an incentive to send them to prison because they could be forced to work essentially as enslaved convicts. Okay, to conclude, I just want to return to the argument I started this lecture with, and that was that while Black men and women's experiences under slavery were similarly shaped by racism and the pursuit of profit by slaveholders, Black women also had distinct experiences based on their gender. Namely, enslaved Black women's sexuality and reproduction, their ability to have children, defined their experiences with slavery, but enslaved Black women, like their male counterparts, always found ways to resist. Okay, and that's it.